My name is Slavin. I'm a senior lecturer in history here at the University of Kent. I'm working on late medieval environment, economic history, and social history. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is famine. And in particular, my research is trying to answer, I think, a very important question. Why, despite the fact that we live in an industrialized world, in globalized world, we still have famine in some parts of the world? And I would like to start with a very interesting quotation from one of the, I think, widely read bestsellers by Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus, where he said that famine is disappearing and you are more at risk of obesity than starvation. Well, I mean, it certainly sounds very optimistic, but it's still quite far from reality. Because if you look here, if you look on this graph, the last couple of years were particularly bad for some parts of the world, in particular for Eastern Africa. There are three countries, as of today, in 2017. You have Somalia, you have Southern Sudan, and you have Yemen, which suffer from very, very serious subsistence crisis, which can be seen as famine. And according to the Famine Early Warning System Network, you have quite a few places in Central and Eastern Africa which are found in very dire straits as far as food security is concerned. So what I want to try to answer here is very simple but very, very important question. Why famines happen? Grossly oversimplifying, we can say that there are three schools of thought or three approaches to famine. One approach can be called environmentalist. So you have this idea that it's really environment, things like natural disasters or plant diseases that devastate harvests, and that's how famine is created. And this is something which is very much favored by some environmental scientists and environmental historians. Another approach or another view on famine is purely demographic. You have the idea that once you have overpopulation and humans really like to multiply in very, very fast pace, so sooner or later you will run into the risk of overpopulation, into the risks of poverty, and not before too long it will really transform into famine, because simply because people will not have enough resources to procure for themselves, procure for their families. Another approach which can be called institutional or anthropogenic, and this approach is very much favored by some development economists and by some political thinkers. So this approach really blames us, blames humans, human institutions, and human decisions in creating famine. And there's no question that all three approaches have very, very strong validities, very, very strong intellectual and empirical justification. I think that all of them have one problem in common. They tend to be a little bit narrow-minded, they tend to be a little bit absolutist. In other words, it's either this or that. And I think that in reality, famine tends to be much more complex, much more complicated phenomenon, which cannot be explained by any one singular factor or any singular cause. And this really makes me wonder, do we really understand what famine is? And if we don't, how can we actually start understanding famine? I'm not pretending to say that I understand how famine works, but I think that I can propose something which will perhaps contribute to our intellectual ability to understand the very complicated dynamics of famine. So, first of all, in order to eradicate famine, we really have to have better understanding of famine. And the historians have very important, I believe, advantage over policymakers and the NGOs, in the sense that they have more information. They have historical information about different historical famines of the past. They can be used as a very powerful tool in order to understand our very contemporary famines. In all cases, when studying any famine in any period, I believe that we have to take into account three what I call metastructures that are interacting one with another and complementing one with another. So these three metastructures are nature, demography, and anthropogenics. In other words, all the same factors that I already brought up a few minutes ago. And each of those metastructures need to be analyzed in a very, very microscopic way. In other words, it really has to be divided into smaller sub-variables. And just to give you one example of why singular kind of reasoning is not very good here is when you look on this map of global drought. So what you have here, you have basically the story of La Nina, this very nasty event that is still going on in some parts of the world. So La Nina of 2010 to 2017 has caused much drought in Eastern Africa, in Western America, and Southeastern Asia. Paradoxically, however, you don't have any famine in Southeastern Asia. You don't even have any food shortage in any part of Western America. But you still have very devastating famine in East Africa. And this is, I think, very good example why you cannot really understand famine through the prism of a singular factor. So instead of taking nature and blaming nature as a bringer of famine, we still have to take nature into account, and we still have to take it very, very seriously. But we also have to measure very critically the impact and the ability of nature to have any impact on food shortage and hence on famine. Having done some work on several historical famines, I can say that even the worst biological, even the worst environmental disaster cannot really destroy your entire harvest. It can maybe destroy half of your harvest, it can maybe destroy about a quarter of your harvest, but in any scenario, you will still be left with some sort of surplus from the harvest. In other words, you still will have something to eat. And the question whether this shortage will turn into a full-fledged famine is really up to other factors. It's up to institutional factors or demographic factors. Now, institutions are to be taken very, very seriously. There are several kinds of institutions that are particularly glaring to be analyzed. First and foremost, we have market performance. How badly will your market be disrupted? How badly your trade in foodstuffs will be disrupted during famine? What is the degree of integration, both local, regional, and national or international, in trade of the same good? How badly the prices will go up? And do you have any way to control this spike in prices? How bad is the black market? How bad is speculation? How bad is the hoarding? Because obviously when you have, when the prices go up, better off elements often tend to take advantage of the situation and hoard the stockpiles of food and wait until, the prices will go up. Another institution which we have to take into consideration is communication. How good is your transportation infrastructure? And obviously there's a big gap or big difference between different countries. What are transportation costs? How badly will food shortage impact transportation costs? What are the transportation risks? Another factor or another institution that we have to take into account here is storage. How secure, how good, and how accessible your storage facilities are. What are the storage costs? In other words, how much would cost you during the shortage to store your grain for a rainy day? We also have to think about military security or military conflict and political security or lack of such. Because if you have war, you can only expect the crisis to be exacerbated even further. Because you have the situation when you have soldiers pillaging your food supplies, you have soldiers coming to a village and extort your food. You also have taxation during the famine, during the war. You also have to think about various mechanisms of famine relief. Does your community have access to local credit? Or does your nation has access to national credit, for example? What are temporary work opportunities that your community or your state has? What are the charitable institutions and how willing they are to collaborate with local communities and help them to survive during the famine? And of course, we also have to think about the role of the state, and perhaps here, state is the most important institution. And as a rule of thumb, there's very strong correlation between different types of government. Democratic governments will never allow shortage to become famine. And if you ask my opinion, for me, one of the most glaring definitions of democracy is that democracy will never allow shortage to become famine. Whereas in authoritarian states or states that are run by authoritarian governments, we have quite a few examples when governments do allow, with no moral reservations, for shortage to become famine. In other words, you really have to think about several institutions and see how those institutions interact and complement one another. Demography, that's another thing that we have to think about. And it's true that overpopulation may have impact on starvation, but you don't have to equate population density or overpopulation with famine. Just to give you this example, an average population density in California is in the area of 97 people per square kilometer. In India, the figures are 445 people per square kilometer, whereas in Somalia, the population density is in the area of 23 people per square kilometer. So despite the fact that both California and especially India are way more densely populated than Somalia, it is in Somalia where you have famine, and not in California or in India. So I think by far more important here is to measure the relation between the population size and the available resources. You also have to measure, you also have to estimate the proportion of poor people within the society. You also have to take into consideration the proportion of young people that have to be fed and old people that have to be fed, because this can have very tremendous impact on the society's ability to be resilient or not to be resilient. Finally, one thing that you always have to keep in mind is each famine is unique, each famine is very different. And you really have to treat each famine in its chronological and cultural context. The experience of hungry people in the early 14th century would be very, very different from the experience of mid-19th century Irishmen during the Great Potato Blight in Ireland. The experience of Irishmen of the 19th century will be very, very different from the experience of the Ukrainians during the Great Ukrainian Holodomor of the 1930s. The experience of the Ukrainians will be very, very different from the experience of Chinese during the Great Leap famine of Mao of 1958, 1961. And of course, all those experiences will be fundamentally different from the experience of contemporary Africans. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that each famine has to be understood as very singular, as very unique, as very singular, and its singularity really has to be, wrapped into its cultural and chronological context. And this is something which, again, historians have very important advantage, because one thing that we historians have to do, we have to contextualize every historical phenomenon, every historical event. So I'm really wrapping up here, and I guess what I was trying to say here today is that famine cannot be really understood by one factor. It cannot really be explained by one cause. It is very, very, very complicated. It's a very, very dynamic phenomenon. And it is really created by a wide array of different factors, and each factor can be subdivided into smaller elements, and each of these elements has to be considered very, very carefully in its cultural and chronological contexts. And I believe that famines can only be understood through historical knowledge and historical analysis. And I really believe that unless we understand famine and how complicated famine is, we cannot attempt to eradicate it. Thank you very much for listening.